There's a map tucked away inside every emergency planning office in California. It's not colorful, it's not pretty, it's not even designed to frighten you. It's a map of rupture zones, fault lines so long, so tense that the Earth could break beneath tens of millions of Americans with no warning. And if you hold that map next to the seismic maps of Kamchatka, they almost look like twins. Kamchatka was a wake-up call. But for many scientists, emergency managers, and military analysts, it wasn't just a warning. It was a preview. A preview of what could happen if a similar 8.8 magnitude megathrust earthquake struck off the coast of California, Oregon, or Washington. Because make no mistake, it's possible. The West Coast sits atop some of the most dangerous and overdue fault systems in the world, and we're not prepared. Let's start with geography. Kamchatka is remote. The quake struck far from major urban centers. It caused digital havoc and exposed global infrastructure flaws, yes, but it did not level cities. The West Coast is different. A quake of the same magnitude striking along the Cascadia subduction zone or the southern stretch of the San Andreas Fault would tear through population centers like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, and Seattle. This isn't theoretical. The US Geological Survey has modeled these outcomes for decades. In a shakeout simulation conducted for Southern California, a 7.8 magnitude quake on the San Andreas was projected to kill 1,900 people, injure 50,000 and cause $200 billion in damage, all in under 2 minutes. Now scale that to an 8.8 and shift it offshore, where it can trigger a tsunami. The Cascadia subduction zone in particular is hauntingly similar to the fault that ruptured near Kamchatka. Stretching from Northern California through Oregon and Washington to British Columbia, it hasn't produced a major quake since January 26, 1700. But geological records show that it generates megaquakes every 300 to 500 years. We're now in year 325. If the entire Cascadia fault ruptured at once, scientists estimate a magnitude 8.7 to 9.2 quake could occur. That would unleash a tsunami similar in power to the one that hit Japan in 2011. It would reach the coast of Oregon in just 15 to 20 minutes. In most towns, there's no high ground within that distance. Unlike Kamchatka, the US West Coast is densely wired. Thousands of critical fiber optic lines run along and across it. Major data centers in the Bay Area, LA, and Seattle serve not just domestic needs, but international data flows. A quake here would not just rattle buildings, it would shake the internet. Satellite uplinks could fail, cell towers would collapse. Submarine cables running into the Pacific could be severed at multiple points. Unlike in Russia, where the failures were localized, the impact here would be immediate, widespread, and global. Think about it. Los Angeles is not just a city, it's a logistics hub. The port of LA and Long Beach together handle about 40% of US containerized imports. If access roads crack, cranes are disabled, or power is cut, the supply chain collapses within hours. Oregon's ports handle timber and grain exports. Seattle feeds tech, shipping, and aerospace. If these break, even temporarily, markets react. Energy costs spike. Supermarkets see shortages. Amazon delivery stops. The health sector is equally exposed. Kamchatka taught us how vulnerable telemedicine is. In the Pacific Northwest and California, many rural communities now depend on virtual health access. A quake would cripple that. Hospitals near the epicenter would suffer structural damage. Backups might not arrive due to blocked roads or fuel shortages. Critical services like dialysis, surgeries, and trauma care would face massive disruption. The 1994 Northridge quake in LA already proved how long it takes to restore even partial capacity after a smaller event. And then there's power. California already faces grid instability from fires and heat waves. An 8.8 quake would decimate substations, rupture gas lines, and topple transmission towers. Blackouts wouldn't last hours, they'd last days or weeks. In Oregon and Washington, entire towns could lose power indefinitely. Diesel for generators? Limited. Fuel trucks may not get through. Schools, water treatment plants, everything stops. But there's another layer unique to the US: political fragmentation. In Kamchatka, the Russian federal response was centralized and decisive, even if slow. In the US, federal, state, and local agencies often clash over control, messaging, and funding. FEMA would be overwhelmed. The National Guard would be deployed, but delays are inevitable. During Katrina and Harvey, we saw what happens when coordination fails. In a West Coast quake, those lessons would be tested at an even larger scale. Social cohesion could crack too. Americans are armed. Misinformation spreads fast. In the absence of power, internet, or leadership, people panic. In 2020, we saw how quickly protests, riots, and civil unrest can emerge, even without a natural disaster. In a megaquake scenario, police capacity would be strained. Jails could be damaged. Supply chain disruptions would affect pharmacies, groceries, and banks. Looting is not just a possibility, it's expected. Now imagine this unfolding not in one city, but across 4 states. That's why emergency planners dread Cascadia and San Andreas alike. It's why governors stage simulations like the Cascadia Rising drill in 2016, involving over 20,000 participants. And yet, the average citizen still doesn't prepare. Most families don't have go-bags. Apartment dwellers don't know their evacuation routes. Coastal communities don't practice tsunami drills. Despite billions in studies, grants, and warnings, we still live as if the ground will never shift. Kamchatka proved that it can, that it will, that the Earth doesn't care how rich or advanced you are. If it moves, you break. So what would really happen if an 8.8 quake struck just off the US West Coast tomorrow? This video series will explore that scenario, step by step. In the next segment, we'll break down the timeline. What happens in the first 30 seconds, the first hour, and the first 24 hours after a megathrust quake in American territory? From satellite imagery to sensor blackouts, from tsunamis to search and rescue failures, we'll trace the entire path of the quake's aftermath. Because if Kamchatka shook the world, California could break it. And the time to prepare isn't tomorrow, it's now. Imagine it's 6:13 a.m. on a cool spring morning. The sky over San Francisco is just starting to brighten. Along the coast of Oregon, fishing boats are already moving out into the Pacific. In Seattle, commuters are beginning to fill I-5. In Los Angeles, overnight logistics crews are winding down their shifts as the first signs of sunlight break through. And then, the ground moves. Not a rumble, not a shake, a full rupture. The Pacific Plate lurches underneath the North American Plate along the Cascadia subduction zone, release centuries of built-up pressure. In under 5 seconds, buildings begin to shudder. In 12 seconds, the shaking becomes violent. Cars bounce, glass shatters, bridges sway. By the 20-second mark, it's too late to do anything but hold on. This is not just theoretical. The US Geological Survey has run this simulation dozens of times. And every time, the opening moments follow the same brutal choreography. Silence, followed by chaos. In the first 30 seconds, the automated early warning system, Shake Alert, detects the rupture and sends emergency push alerts to smartphones across the West Coast. Some receive it in time. Many do not. Cellular congestion instantly overwhelms networks. Trains in motion, like BART in the Bay Area and Amtrak in Oregon, receive emergency braking commands. Most stop, some don't. Air traffic control halts takeoffs across LAX, SFO and SeaTac. Pilots brace as control towers shake and radar stations lose connection. Hospitals switch to emergency protocol. Surgery rooms freeze mid-operation. ICU monitors flicker. By the 1-minute mark, in downtown Portland, glass rains from high rises. A freeway overpass collapses onto I-405. In Tacoma, the old Murray-Morgan Bridge fractures. In San Francisco's Marina District, built on soft landfill, the ground ripples and liquefies. Entire buildings tilt as the soil turns to mush. The tsunami warning system is triggered by NOAA sensors offshore. Within 3 minutes, a tsunami alert is issued for the entire Pacific Northwest coast. Panic begins. Millions of people, confused and unprepared, rush into streets and highways. Cars jam roads inland. In coastal towns like Newport, Seaside, and Crescent City, residents have less than 20 minutes to get to higher ground. By the first hour, fires break out across Los Angeles and San Francisco from ruptured gas lines. In Oakland, a chemical plant sustains structural damage, releasing fumes into nearby neighborhoods. Power grids fail. Transformer stations explode. Over 3 million people lose electricity from Santa Barbara to the Oregon border. Social media collapses. Instagram, WhatsApp, and TikTok go silent across large parts of the West Coast due to data center outages and submarine cable disruption. In the chaos, misinformation spreads rapidly on what limited networks remain. Emergency responders are overwhelmed. In Seattle, the 911 system goes offline for 12 minutes. Helicopters are grounded by high winds and smoke. The tsunami hits the Oregon coast. A wall of water as high as 30 feet crashes into Cannon Beach, sweeping away homes, cars, and entire streets. In Northern California, Crescent City is inundated. Boats are flung blocks inland. Marina districts are destroyed. Evacuation zones see mass casualties, not from the tsunami, but from gridlocked traffic, blocked routes, and late alerts. In some areas, people flee toward the wave, not away from it. By the end of day one, more than 10,000 are confirmed dead or missing. Hospitals are overcrowded, understaffed, and operating on generator power. Military bases from California to Washington go into full activation. The National Guard is deployed, but road damage and airstrip closures delay response. Amazon's Seattle HQ goes dark. Microsoft suspends Azure operations in the region. Google reroutes traffic away from its Bay Area servers. The Port of Oakland, a key shipping hub, shuts down indefinitely due to dock collapse. In LA, the Port of Long Beach suffers fire and fuel leakage, halting cargo unloading and triggering a 72-hour port-wide emergency. Oil refineries in the Bay Area shut down, pushing gasoline prices up $2 per gallon in less than 12 hours. The US energy market panics. Coastal towns are unrecognizable. Entire beachside communities have disappeared. Drones fly overhead, capturing what can only be described as post-apocalyptic scenes. But the worst isn't over. Day 2 to day 7 sees a growing crisis. Aftershocks, some as high as magnitude 7.0, continue every few hours. Buildings that survived the initial quake begin to crumble. Tsunami debris clogs harbors and waterways, preventing rescue ships from entering. Inland cities like Sacramento, Fresno, and Spokane take in hundreds of thousands of displaced residents, triggering food and water shortages. Communications are spotty at best. Only satellite phones and ham radio networks provide stable contact. Wildfires spread unchecked across Northern California, fueled by broken water mains and blocked roads. Firefighting aircraft are grounded due to damaged runways and hangars. Federal response agencies struggle with logistics. FEMA's West Coast distribution centers in Bothell, WA and Oakland, CA are compromised. Supplies are delayed. The Department of Defense reroutes humanitarian aid from eastern bases, but military aircraft face delays due to air traffic system collapse. The President declares a nationwide emergency. Congress begins drafting a multi-trillion-dollar disaster relief package, halting all other legislative activity. Amid all this, one question echoes. How did this happen so fast? The answer is brutal in its simplicity, because we live in denial. We know about Cascadia. We know about the San Andreas Fault. We've run the simulations. We've printed the evacuation maps. But year after year, Americans fail to prepare. Only 12% of Californians have a full emergency supply kit. In Oregon, many coastal communities lack vertical evacuation infrastructure. Washington's urban centers have seismic retrofitting laws, but compliance is slow and expensive. And for decades, the belief has lingered that a quake of this size is too rare, too distant, too unlikely. Until now. Kamchatka showed us the blueprint, but if it had hit here, in one of the most populous, tech-dependent regions of the planet, the damage would not be a ripple. It would be a collapse. In the next segment, we'll explore the collapse of infrastructure, power, water, transit, and digital networks. What breaks, when it breaks, and how long it takes to come back online in the wake of an American megathrust earthquake. Because one day, perhaps soon, it won't be Kamchatka in the headlines. It'll be us. In the aftermath of the first shockwaves and the tsunami's brutal impact, attention shifts to what keeps modern society running: infrastructure. Not just buildings, but the hidden skeleton: power lines, water systems, transportation, and digital networks. Without them, cities collapse into primitive chaos in mere days. Kamchatka's quake exposed these vulnerabilities, but in the US, they're magnified. Let's start with electricity. The West Coast grid is a patchwork of public utilities, private companies, and renewable sources. California alone depends heavily on transmission lines that snake through wildfire-prone mountains. When the ground ruptures, these towers crumple like toothpicks. Substations burn. Underground cables shear. Hydroelectric dams in Oregon and Washington may survive the quake, but lose connection to delivery lines. Solar panels shatter under debris. Wind turbines shut down due to automatic safety triggers or structural misalignment. Within seconds of the quake, rolling blackouts expand from urban cores to the suburbs. By hour 2, the blackout isn't rolling, it's total. Data from past events suggest it could take 7 to 30 days to restore even partial power in some areas. In rural Oregon and coastal California, it might take months. Backup generators, if not destroyed in the quake, can only function with diesel, and diesel deliveries stop when roads split and bridges fall. Hospitals, grocery stores and shelters run on borrowed time. Insulin spoils. Baby formula can't be warm. Heating and cooling systems fail. And this is just the first domino. Next comes water. The water infrastructure of cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco is outdated and brittle. LA's water comes from hundreds of miles away, funneled through aqueducts and mountain pipelines that cross multiple fault lines. In a megathrust event, dozens of these pipelines rupture instantly. Reservoirs crack, storage tanks collapse, treatment plants lose power, chlorination systems go offline. Within 72 hours, tap water becomes unsafe to drink. Boil water advisories are issued, but few have gas or electricity to boil anything. In Seattle, the story is no better. Reservoirs like Tolt and Cedar could suffer structural damage. If even one fails, 1.5 million people lose water access overnight. Toilets stop flushing. Fire hydrants run dry. Refugees from tsunami zones overwhelm shelter capacities. The US has never experienced an urban humanitarian water crisis at this scale, but it would in this scenario. Transportation doesn't escape either. California's freeway system is vast but old. Hundreds of overpasses were retrofitted after the 1989 Loma Prieta quake, but many still rest on fragile soil or outdated foundations. In an 8.8 event, dozens of critical highway connectors collapse, cutting off escape routes and blocking emergency services. The Bay Bridge, a lifeline between San Francisco and Oakland, might hold, but if it doesn't, the city becomes an island. Airports like SFO, SEA and PDX suffer runway buckling and terminal damage. Flights are grounded indefinitely. Rail lines, including freight tracks and Amtrak passenger corridors, are twisted and useless. Ports suffer docking tower collapse and shipping crane failure. Container ships idle offshore, unable to unload. Within 48 hours, food distribution halts. Refrigerated items spoil. Grocery stores empty. Panic buying intensifies. In small towns, gas stations run dry and ATMs fail. Now zoom in on the digital networks. The internet may seem wireless, but it's anything but. Physical servers, cables and power lines carry your Zoom calls, TikTok videos and emergency texts. In Kamchatka, multiple undersea cables snapped. In the US, that number could easily double or triple. West Coast data centers, particularly in Silicon Valley and Seattle, are vital not just for the region, but for global tech operations. If a major data hub goes offline, it creates ripple effects across cloud storage, banking systems, and communication tools. Slack crashes, Google Drive stalls, YouTube buffering increases globally. More critically, emergency systems, 911 calls, dispatch servers, traffic lights, hospital records fail. Satellite backups exist, but they're limited, and they don't reach the last mile where people live and suffer. Without data, coordination crumbles. Government officials lose communication with mayors, sheriffs, and fire chiefs. First responders lack real-time mapping or resource data. Evacuation orders can't be updated. Family members can't check in with each other. This isn't just inconvenient, it's deadly. Now add fuel to the fire, literally. Gas pipelines running along the west coast crack open during the quake. Leaks spark explosions in residential neighborhoods and industrial zones. Fire departments, already crippled by collapsed roads and dry hydrants, can't respond effectively. This happened before. In the 1994 Northridge quake, a gas main explosion killed an entire family. Multiply that by 100 and scatter it across 4 states. That's the scale we're facing. And what about law enforcement? Police departments are understaffed, damaged, and overwhelmed. Jails and prisons may experience security breaches. Armed civilians begin guarding gas stations and grocery stores. Curfews are announced, then ignored. Panic gives way to opportunism. Looting isn't just a possibility, it becomes a widespread reality. High-end retail, electronics, even pharmacies are targeted. In some cities, National Guard troops must step in. In others, local governments hesitate, fearful of escalating violence or accusations of overreach. This is the moment when public trust begins to erode. For every hour without power, for every day without clear communication or aid, The social contract frays. Communities fragment. Neighborhoods turn inward. Some cooperate and survive. Others collapse into chaos. And still the aftershocks continue. Every rumble brings new fear. Is this the next big one? Will the house finally fall? Should we leave? But go where? There's no clear answer. Refugee camps are filling up. Hotels are booked. Friends and family are already hosting others. Evacuation orders stretch beyond the coast, past the mountains, even into Nevada. Then there's the economic toll. In less than a week, the projected damage exceeds $1 trillion. The 2008 financial crisis cost less. Insurance companies scramble to calculate liabilities. Stock markets plunge. The global economy reels as Silicon Valley falters and Pacific trade halts. And none of this accounts for the emotional trauma, the invisible scars. Children pulled from rubble, pets lost, family members missing, homes gone, entire towns wiped off the map. What Kamchatka revealed was not just a scientific risk, but a mirror. A glimpse into what could happen here, to us in our cities, on our streets, in our lifetimes. In Part 4, we'll examine the emergency response and how different agencies would act in the first week. Would FEMA cope? Would the military step in? How would leadership unfold or fail under unimaginable pressure? Because the earthquake is only the beginning. What comes after will define who we are. In every disaster scenario, there's a second quake, one that isn't geological. It hits slower but spreads further. It's the human response, the way institutions, systems, and leaders react or fail to. In Kamchatka, much of the impact remained local due to sparse population. In the US, however, the aftermath of a West Coast megaquake would hinge on one question: can the system respond in time? The first 72 hours are the most critical. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, has extensive protocols for large-scale disasters. It's run simulations like Cascadia Rising, involving thousands of emergency personnel. But simulations on paper rarely match reality. Within the first day, FEMA headquarters in Washington, D.C. would activate its Regional Response Coordination Centers. Region 9, responsible for California, and Region X, covering Oregon and Washington, would declare Level 1 emergencies, their highest status. Mobile Emergency Response Support, MERS units would deploy, assuming they can navigate broken highways and downed air traffic systems. But here's the problem. FEMA's warehouses, stocked with water, blankets, generators, and medical supplies, are mostly located inland. Transportation routes are now compromised. Trucks are rerouted hundreds of miles. Helicopters are prioritized for medical evacuation, not aid drops. In many locations, local authorities are left on their own for the first 24 to 48 hours. Then come the coordination problems. The US disaster response system is decentralized. States control their National Guard units. County sheriffs run local evacuation. City mayors decide curfews. This layered chain of command, while theoretically robust, often becomes chaotic under pressure. In Los Angeles, for example, the mayor may be unable to communicate with state leaders in Sacramento if comms go down. Satellite phones may be the only connection, and not everyone has one. This is where the National Guard comes in. Governors from California, Oregon, and Washington would each deploy Guard troops, but activation takes time. Soldiers must be contacted, geared up, and safely transported into disaster zones. Many live in the same affected areas. They may be rescuing their own families. Once deployed, Guard duties would include assisting search and rescue efforts, setting up field hospitals, providing security at evacuation centers and supply distribution points, transporting the injured via Black Hawk helicopters or emergency vehicles. If civil unrest escalates, such as widespread looting, arson, or armed conflict at gas stations, the President may invoke the Insurrection Act to federalize the National Guard or deploy active duty military units. This would be highly controversial and risk further public tension. Meanwhile, FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, would set up incident support bases in neighboring states like Nevada, Idaho, and Arizona. These would serve as staging grounds for relief convoys, mobile clinics, and communications equipment. Hospitals are a flashpoint. Urban trauma centers like UCLA Medical Center, UCSF, and Harborview in Seattle would be overloaded. Makeshift triage tents would be erected in stadiums, schools, and open fields. Medical staff from across the country would be flown in, assuming airports are operational. The Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, would deploy its National Disaster Medical System. This includes Disaster Medical Assistance Teams, DMATs, trauma and burn units, mortuary teams for handling mass casualties. The number of dead could exceed 30,000 in a worst-case scenario. Morgues would overflow. Mobile refrigeration trucks would be needed. Families might wait weeks for confirmation of missing loved ones. One of the least visible but most crucial parts of disaster response is continuity of government. What happens if local officials are killed, injured, or unreachable? FEMA has pre-designated emergency successors for key positions. But if entire city councils are displaced or incapacitated, replacement becomes messy. Martial law may be declared in some regions, not nationwide, but city by city. This grants broad emergency powers to the military or federal authorities, allowing them to override local governments. At the same time, civil liberties become a balancing act. Curfews, travel restrictions, mandatory evacuations. In a crisis, these measures save lives, but they also stir resistance, especially in areas where distrust of federal authority runs deep. Gun ownership in the Pacific Northwest is high. If aid doesn't come fast enough, some communities will turn inward, patrol their own neighborhoods, decide who enters and who doesn't. Social media platforms will be crippled, but not silent. People will still post from unaffected zones, drone footage, survivor accounts, viral rumors. The White House will issue regular briefings, but they may not reach everyone. In an information vacuum, conspiracy theories fill the void. Was the quake man-made? Is FEMA hiding the death toll? Has the government lost control? Misinformation could spread faster than relief. And then there's the international response. Canada, Japan, and the EU would offer aid. NATO may activate its disaster response coordination centers. Chinese and Russian state media would likely broadcast dramatic footage of US chaos, framing it as a symbol of Western fragility. Cyber attacks on US infrastructure may increase during this moment of vulnerability. The Pentagon would remain on high alert, guarding against both physical and digital threats. Domestically, Congress would convene emergency sessions. Bills would be introduced to unlock billions in disaster funding. But political division could slow the process. If the quake occurs near a major election, the impact on voting logistics, campaigning, and national unity could be immense. Meanwhile, non-profits become lifelines. The Red Cross, Salvation Army, and faith-based groups like Samaritan's Purse would activate volunteers nationwide. Churches convert into shelters. Community kitchens distribute meals. Small towns not directly affected become hosts to hundreds of thousands of displaced people. Mental health crisis teams will also be needed. Survivors may suffer from PTSD, panic attacks, survivor's guilt. Suicide rates often rise after major disasters, but counseling access is limited, especially when phones are down and clinics are overwhelmed. Weeks later, the media narrative will shift from breaking news to recovery stories, from drone footage of floods to interviews with families who lost everything. The question will be asked again and again, were we prepared? Could more have been done? And the answer, like always, will be yes. In Part 5, we'll explore the economic consequences of this quake, how the US economy, global markets, housing, insurance, and labor would react to a $2 trillion catastrophe. Because when the Earth shakes, it doesn't stop at lives lost. It hits every corner of modern life, especially the money. The shaking has stopped. The water has receded. The fires are smoldering. But now comes the longest and perhaps most painful phase of the crisis, the economic collapse. In the hours after a West Coast mega-quake, financial markets begin to panic. By the end of the first week, the damage isn't just local, it's global. What began as a geological rupture in the Earth now tears through the economic fabric of the United States. Let's begin with insurance, or the lack of it. In California, only about 10% of homeowners carry earthquake insurance. In Oregon and Washington, that number is even lower. The reason? It's expensive and doesn't cover everything. Deductibles can be as high as 20% of the property value. So when buildings collapse or suffer structural damage, millions of people find themselves with no financial safety net. Insurance companies, especially those exposed to the Pacific coast, are hit with tens of billions in claims. Several regional providers go bankrupt within the first month. Larger firms begin to restrict new policies, raise premiums, or withdraw from high-risk areas altogether. By week 2, the federal government is forced to step in. Congress rushes through a $500 billion emergency relief bill. But it's not enough. The long-term rebuilding cost is estimated at $2 trillion, potentially higher than the combined costs of Hurricanes Katrina, Sandy, Harvey, and Maria. Real estate markets across the country begin to react. Home values in the affected areas plummet. Mortgage defaults skyrocket. Banks begin marking down property assets. Even in cities untouched by the quake, uncertainty spreads. Investors start questioning the true risk of holding real estate near fault zones. Meanwhile, supply chains seize up. California's Central Valley, responsible for a large portion of America's fruits, vegetables, and nuts, suffers irrigation failures, worker shortages, and road damage. Crops rot in the fields. Deliveries are missed. Supermarkets nationwide begin rationing produce. At the same time, the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, the two largest in the US, are either shut down or operating at minimal capacity. Together, they handle over 40% of all US imports, especially electronics, clothing, and auto parts from Asia. With the ports crippled, thousands of shipping containers sit idle. Trucking companies can't access cargo. Rail yards are backed up. Auto manufacturing plants in the Midwest halt production due to missing components. Big box retailers scramble to restock shelves. Holiday season inventory is delayed or cancelled. Consumers notice price spikes within days. Now shift to the tech sector. Silicon Valley is not only home to major companies, Apple, Google, Meta, Nvidia, but also to thousands of cloud servers, AI training centers, and critical data hubs. A megaquake may not destroy all of them physically, but the disruptions from infrastructure failures, power loss, and personnel displacement are profound. Startups shutter. Venture capital freezes. Tech employees relocate or go remote indefinitely. Confidence in the US tech backbone is shaken. Overseas rivals, particularly in China and India, see opportunity. Stock markets react accordingly. The Dow Jones drops 2,000 points on day one, triggered by the quake and ensuing uncertainty. Nasdaq plunges as major tech firms issue earnings warnings. Insurance stocks fall sharply. Construction stocks spike briefly, only to fall again as labor shortages and material bottlenecks set in. The Federal Reserve issues an emergency rate cut. The Treasury Department suspends certain lending requirements, but investors remain wary. Panic ripples into global markets. Japan's Nikkei dips. China's Shanghai Composite reacts to US port closures. European banks with US exposure adjust their balance sheets. Oil prices rise, not just from refinery damage in the Bay Area, but from perceived instability in a key energy-consuming region. And then comes the human cost to labor and employment. Thousands of businesses, from family-owned shops to corporate giants, are destroyed, damaged, or unable to operate. Millions of workers are displaced. Construction labor is in high demand, but housing is short. Many families are forced to move out of state. Entire cities see population decline in a matter of weeks. Unemployment claims surge. State systems struggle to keep up. Incomes are lost. Savings are drained. For lower-income workers, the quake becomes a tipping point into long-term poverty. Simultaneously, homelessness spikes. People with no insurance, no job, and no shelter begin flooding into emergency camps, community centers, or just the streets. Cities like Sacramento, Reno, Boise, and Salt Lake City experience a refugee crisis, stretching resources, stoking political tensions, and triggering debates about housing, zoning, and public safety. FEMA's rental assistance program kicks in, but demand far outstrips supply. Landlords in neighboring states raise rents. Price gouging investigations begin. The housing crisis, already bad before the quake, explodes into a full-blown national emergency. Federal and state governments begin discussing long-term recovery bonds, similar to post-World War II reconstruction efforts. Infrastructure bills are rewritten. Tax proposals emerge to fund rebuilding. But partisan gridlock threatens delays. While political leaders argue over funding, communities wait for water, power, and safety. Meanwhile, Wall Street and Main Street diverge. Investors speculate on disaster recovery. Stocks in construction firms, water tech companies, and alternative energy providers surge. But on the ground, small business owners are selling assets, applying for SBA loans, and trying to rebuild without clarity on when or if customers will return. International aid offers a rare moment of unity. Japan sends disaster specialists. Canada opens temporary refugee housing. The United Nations offers coordination support, but the narrative is clear. America, long the global aid leader, is now a recipient. And what about energy? California's grid goes down, hydroelectric dams are damaged or disconnected, solar farms are partially destroyed, gas lines leak. The Western interconnection, the grid shared by multiple states, becomes unstable. Rolling blackouts extend into Nevada, Arizona, and parts of Colorado. Energy traders panic. The futures market sees volatile spikes. The Department of Energy orders emergency reserves released. Gasoline prices jump 30% in some regions. Lines at stations return for the first time in decades. Green energy advocates push for accelerated transition. Critics blame renewables for instability. The national debate over energy policy intensifies overnight. In all this, the emotional economy suffers too. Tourism collapses. National parks in affected zones are closed indefinitely. Wine country in Napa and Sonoma lies in ruins. Beaches are contaminated or washed away. Cultural landmarks are gone. Americans postpone weddings, cancel trips, stop spending. Consumer confidence plummets. Depression and anxiety rise. Local economies built on service, leisure, plus, and hope find themselves without customers, or hope. But perhaps the most lasting economic impact is psychological. For decades, Americans believed the West Coast was a hub of innovation, opportunity, and climate beauty. Now it's seen as vulnerable, unpredictable, and possibly unlivable. In the coming years, we may see mass relocation, people leaving fault zones, companies re-evaluating where to build, investors weighing climate and seismic risk with every dollar. Kamchatka was a warning. But if it happens here, the damage won't just be financial, it will be existential. A reshaping of how Americans think about risk, geography, resilience, and recovery. In the final part of this video, we'll ask the most important question of all. Are we ready? And if not, what must change, starting today, to ensure that the next disaster doesn't become the end of life as we know it? The question echoes louder now than ever. Are we ready? Not just for the tremble of the ground or the crash of waves, but for the weeks, months, and years that follow. In this final chapter, we confront the brutal truth behind the preparedness gap in the United States. The scenario we've just walked through is not fantasy, it's forecast. And the difference between devastation and survival begins today, not the day the quake hits. Let's talk about preparedness culture. In Japan, earthquake drills are a routine part of school and workplace life. Emergency kits are expected in every household. Retrofitting buildings is national policy, not just a suggestion. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake was devastating, but Japanese infrastructure and public training saved thousands of lives. In the US, that culture barely exists, especially in the Pacific Northwest. While California has made strides, Oregon and Washington remain dangerously underprepared. Thousands of unreinforced masonry buildings still house families, businesses, and schools. Tsunami evacuation routes exist on paper but are poorly marked or impassable. Most citizens don't know the difference between the San Andreas Fault and the Cascadia subduction zone. And that's the issue. Risk without recognition is useless. According to the US Geological Survey, USGS, there is a 37% chance of a major quake along the Cascadia subduction zone in the next 50 years. That's not a maybe. It's a matter of when. Yet budgets for retrofitting, public education, and infrastructure upgrades remain limited, often postponed for political convenience. Why? Because disasters are only urgent when they're happening. Now let's focus on early warning systems. The West Coast has started deploying Shake Alert, an earthquake early warning system. It can provide a few seconds of notice, enough to stop trains, pause surgeries, and get people under desks. But implementation is spotty. Many people don't know how to receive alerts. Some buildings and agencies haven't integrated the system. And for a quake originating offshore, like Kamchatka's or Cascadia's, those precious seconds may not be enough. Then there's resilience planning. Most cities have general emergency plans, but few simulate true mega-disaster scale. How do you evacuate 1 million people when roads collapse? How do you shelter 500,000 when hospitals and stadiums are cracked open? How do you communicate when cell towers are down? FEMA has blueprints, states have playbooks, but coordination across jurisdictions remains a weakness. The 2005 response to Hurricane Katrina exposed it. COVID-19 reinforced it. A megaquake would make it unavoidable. That's where community resilience becomes the linchpin. government can't do it alone. Local response, neighborhoods helping neighbors, is often the first and most effective layer of survival. CERTs, community emergency response teams, church networks, local food banks, and amateur radio operators play outsized roles. But they require training, funding, and encouragement. In many parts of the West Coast, those networks are thin or non-existent. Next, consider infrastructure investment. Retrofitting bridges, reinforcing dams, rebuilding schools and hospitals to seismic standards. These actions are costly, yes, but cheaper than rebuilding from rubble. After the Northridge quake in 1994, California invested billions in seismic upgrades. But similar action hasn't happened across the board. Oregon's K-12 schools, most haven't been upgraded. Washington's emergency communication towers, some still sit on unstable ground. Coastal towns in tsunami zones, few have vertical evacuation structures. It's not just a gap, it's a glaring hole. And the private sector isn't immune. Tech giants, port authorities, real estate developers, they must become part of the solution. Companies with vast resources can invest in resilient campuses, supply chains, and employee preparedness. But without incentives or pressure, many don't. Then comes the matter of legislation. Mandates for retrofitting, zoning laws that prohibit new development in tsunami zones, tax credits for earthquake insurance. These are the tools of prevention. But political courage is lacking. Nobody wants to be the mayor who told developers no. No one gets re-elected for championing disaster scenarios that haven't happened yet, until they do. In schools, earthquake education is often limited to drop, cover, and hold on. That's useful, but not enough. Students should know the local fault lines. They should practice tsunami routes. They should understand the long-term reality of infrastructure loss. The next generation will inherit the consequences if we don't teach them now. And finally, public mindset. Preparedness is not fear-mongering, it's realism. Fire alarms don't mean you expect a fire every day. They mean you want to live if one starts. Earthquake kits, evacuation maps, and community drills should be as normal as seatbelts and smoke detectors. But cultural narratives often romanticize survival as something spontaneous, grabbing a backpack, running into the forest, living off instinct. That's not how real disasters work. They require boring, unsexy, painstaking preparation, the kind that happens before anything goes wrong. So what can individuals do? Build a 2-week emergency kit. Water, food, meds, sanitation. Know your local evacuation routes. Secure your home's heavy furniture and gas lines. Join or form a local CERT team. Talk to your neighbors. Know who needs help. And most importantly, demand accountability. From elected officials, from school boards, from utility companies. Preparedness is not a luxury, it's a right. Let Kamchatka be our warning, not our mirror. Because if we wait until it's our cities crumbling, our highways breaking, our loved ones missing, it will be too late. The US still has time to prepare, but not unlimited time. Crisis doesn't wait for consensus, neither should resilience. If you found this video thought-provoking, informative, or urgent, subscribe to Crisis Lens and help us bring awareness to the risks we face and the solutions we need. We tell the stories others ignore before it's too late.